Good morning. My name is David Plazas, Opinion Engagement Editor for the Tennessean, and I'm here with my colleague Frank Daniels, also of the editorial board here at the Tennessean, and we're talking to David Briley, who is a candidate for vice mayor. The election this year is on August 6th, and it is a two-man race, so we have the pleasure of having him here to talk about his life and his experience and his thoughts about this important role. So welcome to the editorial board.
Thank you for having me.
And absolutely, and for our readership, would you mind talking a little bit about your own biography, a little bit about yourself, please?
Right, sure. Let me start just by giving my little spiel about why I want to be vice mayor, and then I'll fill you in on a little bit of my bio. I'm running for vice mayor because, like everybody here, I love Nashville. And I want to see it both protect what's great here and improve in areas where we can stand to improve. And there are three values that I'm going to pursue and make sure our government is focused on as vice mayor. And those are inclusion, transparency, and accountability. And I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about those more as we go along, but briefly, inclusion means to me that we are intentional and systematic about reaching out to the public before big decisions are made. Transparency means that we make sure that everybody understands the process, that decisions as they're made, people see them being made and understand how the decision is being made. And then accountability, the Metro Council especially, is where accountability really can be important. And making sure that decisions made by the administration and the departments are scrutinized, and we look back periodically to make sure that we made good decisions. And I think if the mayor knows and the departments know that the council is going to demand accountability, the mayor does a better job. And we get a better product as a city, and we move in a better direction. So that's why I'm running. I grew up here in Nashville, but went away to college in 1982. And I lived other places. I lived in Washington, D.C., where I went to undergrad. I lived in New York for about a year. I lived in San Francisco for 8 years, where I went to law school and began my law career. And I lived in Latin America, where I traveled for about a year. And so I won't say fluent, but I'm conversant in Spanish. I'm married to Jody Bell, who is also a lawyer here in town, and we have a 12-year-old son. I am a practicing lawyer full-time, representing individuals and small businesses in civil litigation. That's what I do for a living. And so I'm excited about the prospects for our city. I think we are seeing unprecedented growth, which is going to require unprecedented attention from the council and vice mayor. And I feel like I am best situated to do that for our city, and have been working hard since March of 2014 when I announced that I would be running. I've been going to event after event and meeting all kinds of new people in our community, and look forward to serving as vice mayor for 4 years if I'm elected.
What's the role in your mind of the vice mayor in the three things you talked about: inclusion, transparency, and accountability?
Right.
The vice mayor has a very different role from a council member.
Right.
And just sort of curious how you see you in that role achieving those three targets.
Right. Well, Nashville, from a legal standpoint, has a very unique vice mayor. And I'm not exactly sure why it ended up the way it did. I imagine there are different theories about why we have the kind of vice mayor we do. But I'll talk about inclusion for starters. I recently went with the Chamber of Commerce to Salt Lake City, and on their annual trip, to see what other cities are doing. And one of the highlights to me was a public engagement policy, a written public engagement policy that they've adopted. And I think we need one. Nashville needs one. So as soon as we have a new mayor, I intend to sit down with her or him and say, who can I appoint on the council to work with you to develop that policy? And if they make a commitment to do that, which I assume they all will, because I think we all know now that we need to work harder on public engagement, I will appoint somebody, and within a few weeks, I hope, we will have a written public engagement policy that requires intentional and systematic and persistent outreach to the public. It's leadership in that role. That's really what it's all about. I'm also going to encourage council members and reward those who follow through on doing the same kind of thing. Don't wait for your constituents to talk about a particular zoning issue. Talk to your constituents consistently and persistently about what do they want in their community. If you do that, then you're in a better spot as a council member to help navigate a community through a contentious zoning issue.
You mentioned rewarding these council members. How do you do that, and how do you hold them accountable if they don't take these actions?
Right. Well, I think you reward them. One of the things I intend to do is to meet with all 40 council members as soon as I'm elected, and we have 40, and talk to them each about, what do you want to accomplish as an elected official, and how can I help you do that? And you do that by putting them on the committee that's important to them, and by naming them vice chair or chair of the committee. And frankly, by dedicating my own time to helping them figure out the issues that are important to them, by not by telling them what to do, but by communicating to them my experience, the history of the community, and how things have been accomplished best. It's leadership. It's not. It is a limited role that the vice mayor has and limited authority. So you really have to be a leader. Transparency. The council has changed over time. 50 years ago, it was essentially white men, and a lot of decisions were made in secret. We've moved away from that, and I'm going to continue to push us further and further away from that. And the council office has already started the process under the leadership of Vice Mayor Neighbors to put more and more information online, so that as information is provided to council members and they are relying on it to make their decisions, it's available to the public. One instance that I fall back on is I voted to close the thermal transfer plant when I was on the council previously. We were given this big binder that included a pro forma about all the costs and benefits, et cetera. And I've lost my copy. It's been 12, 15 years, so I think I have the right to lose it. But we're not, part of that pro forma said we were going to build $250 million of taxed real estate on that site. Well, we're building a beautiful amphitheater right now.
Right.
If that document were available to the public, there would be the ability to have a little bit better understanding about how decisions are made, whether or not the representations that the council relied upon ended up being true or not. And accountability, that is really about who you appoint as committee chairs and put on the committees. And the committee chair is really the spot where a council member, whether she or he, can require the administration to fulfill their obligations at the highest level. It's not about being adversarial. It's not about being against the mayor. What it is about is making sure that the mayor understands that you're going to be thorough, persistent, you're going to read everything that comes before you, you're going to make your decisions based on the merits, not based on a single conversation that you have. And so that I'm going to select the best I can do at the beginning based on who I know on the council and who gets elected, to make sure we get good, hardworking, persistent, compassionate, and thoughtful people in the committee chairs.
Well, I'm curious as to how you think that's going to happen in this particular instance of the council, when we may have as many as 27 or more new members of the council whose experience would be de minimis in terms of how the council operates and what the role of how
Right.
the council can hold
Right.
the mayor and the mayor's office accountable.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of talk about that, and it's legitimate to have that concern. But the turnover in the council that has happened in recent years has resulted in the most diverse body we've ever had. So the turnover is not without its upside. We do end up with younger people, with newer people, with more energy over time. And there is a learning curve, and it can be steep. One of the things I intend to do is expand on what's been done before with a series of learning sessions over the first year. In the past, you might have 1 or 2 meetings with Vanderbilt or the Chamber of Commerce or neighborhood groups to sort of learn about the process and people's interests. We're going to expand that so that it takes maybe a year to get through all the meetings. And that's another way to determine who should be leaders, is who comes, who attends, who wants to learn. So I do think it's going to be a challenge, but I have talked to probably 75 of the people who are running, and they're a fine group of people running. You know, learning the difference between the red and the green button, that's pretty easy, right? It's really, a lot of it is about how does government work, and about how you work with other people.
How does this particular government work?
Right.
Because it is unique.
Yeah, and how do you work with the other people on the council? That's as big a challenge. And I'll give you an example of that to sort of toot someone else's horn. When I was on the council at first, I was a relatively new lawyer, and I talked a lot. And I was pulled aside by the vice mayor, and he said to me, "You're acting like a first-year law student." And that's all he needed to say to me. I learned a lot from that experience.
Vice mayor?
That was Ronnie Stein.
Okay.
So a lot of moving people up the learning curve is that day-to-day, how you doing? What are you working on? How can I help you? That I intend to be very persistent with and reach out constantly with the council members just to touch base. Make sure they know that I'm not meddling, but I want to know how I can help them.
I'd be curious to know more about your belief of the relationship between the vice mayor and the mayor. You know, for some it might be an adversarial relationship, for some it might be a cheerleader. How would you define that, and how would you react to if the mayor had a policy that you disagreed with? How would you approach that?
Well, I'm not going to vote on anything unless there's a tie, right? So I don't really look at the vice mayor's role predominantly as being a relationship with the mayor. The vice mayor's predominant role is to make sure that the council works well. And to me, a well-running council means that everything that comes from the mayor gets scrutinized closely, but with fairness. And I think if that happens, that the relationship between the mayor and the vice mayor will be just fine. I am sure that the next mayor will not get everything she or he wants. And at that point in time, I'll get blamed for it at some point. I'm sure that's just it's human nature, right? But that's just politics. You move through that. I don't think it's an adversarial relationship. I also don't think it's a cheerleader relationship. I think it's just being a good manager, a good organizer of the Metro Council. And if I do that, then the mayor and the vice mayor will get along just fine. And I think we've got 7 fine candidates and look forward to working with whomever gets elected. It's a short circuit. One other question that might come.
Have you endorsed one?
No, and I won't.
Okay.
I will not. Even in the runoff, I will not do it, because I think that would undermine my ability to work with whoever won. Even if the person I picked won, it would make it more difficult to work with that person, I think. So I just intend to stay out of it. I'm glad that there are only 2 of us in the race, because it'll give me a 6-week head start to start going out and talking to the 15 or 20 people who are already elected and start to get to know them better and find out what they want to do and start planning the process of implementing and bringing new council up to speed.
What are the things that the current council, and maybe the last several councils, are doing that you think needs to be changed?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the things that past councils have done that you want to bring back?
Well, I don't really look at it that way, I'll be honest with you. I think each vice mayor has confronted a different set of circumstances. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was a very static group of people. And the council was the same for a long time. You had a core group that had been there for a long time. And so under those circumstances, you really run the council in a different way than when you're getting 20 new people every year. And so I think Vice Mayor Scobie had a good reputation for running, for having a good council that really focused on accountability because they had a lot of experience. Vice Mayor Neighbors has really done a good job of running a very civil, organized meeting, and I think that's great. Vice Mayor Gentry was great, I think, in terms of allowing a lot of discussion, which people need. People need to see the council thoroughly vetting ideas. And I've already told you that I think Vice Mayor Stein had a great ability to sort of talk to you and fill you in on how you might be perceived. And coaching. He's a good coach, that is correct. I never served with Vice Mayor West, so I can't really say. So to me, it's really not about doing anything different. It's about expanding. And so I think that the council is a great place to germinate ideas that the mayor might not be focused on, and that might not be purely legislative. And so, you look back at the council over the last 20 or so years, and there's some, the focus our community had in the 90s on affordable housing emanated from the Metro Council. We are building public art in our community because of an idea that emanated from the council. The greenways emanated from the council. There's a long list of things that emanated from the council. So I think it is a place to do that, and I'm going to work on that. So if you look back in the last year or so and look at the current situation in our community, transportation and transit is really the narrowness in our river, and where we're really going to struggle to grow as a community if we don't confront that. And I think everybody now acknowledges it's a regional issue, and that means it's going to require a regional solution. So I'm going to start a periodic get-together of municipal legislators from across the region to come together and learn about transportation, what our issues are, what are some of the potential solutions, and start to build more of a good consensus amongst that group, a better working relationship, because frankly we'll have to work together to confront the situation. That's an idea of one thing I really want to see us focus on. I mean, I think.
Have you seen that work in other, you said you want to sort of use examples from other places you've lived or have visited. Have you seen that in other places?
Well, I think Salt Lake City, really, they have done a great job in terms of building out their regional transit, and they were very intentional about working at bringing the municipal legislators and the regional state legislators together to build a consensus for a tax, for a dedicated funding source so they could build out their system. Sure, it's worked there. And that's a place where there's a lot more homogeneity than we have. Right. Politically especially. And so we got to work hard at that to make progress.
One of the things that we've discussed also with candidates has been their support or lack of support for the charter amendments. Would you mind taking us through your positions on those?
So let me see if I can remember them all.
So I'll remind you that it's lowering the size of the council from 40 to 27. That's Amendment 1. Amendment 2 is lowering the size of the council to 27, but also extending term limits, so from 2 to 3. And the third would be essentially requiring that any Davidson County construction project have 40% of local residents be in the workforce.
So the first two, here's what I would say about those. If either one of those passes, I'm going to consider it my responsibility to make sure that they are fairly implemented, because there are some risks associated with both of them. So one is to go to 27 in 3 terms. Is the other one to go to 3 terms only?
No,
just 27.
Just 27.
They're both to reduce the size of the council.
Okay.
So that there's more.
All right. So with either one of those, reducing the size of the council and going to 3 terms or just going to 27, there is a risk that you lose the diversity of representation, or that it becomes more difficult to get elected financially. So, and the rubber's going to hit the road on that when we draw the districts. And I will consider myself to be the leader in that process and the person responsible for making sure that we do everything we can to avoid those risks if they're adopted. So I feel like my ability to be the leader in that requires me to sort of stay on the sidelines a little bit in terms of advocating one side or the other. I do acknowledge the risks, And I think people should be aware of that when they vote. But if it passes, I want to be in a position where I can lead our community through that process with the confidence of both sides.
Right. So given that your assessment of the risk, you think it's not a good idea to reduce the size of the council?
You're asking me to get off the sidelines a little bit, and I'm trying not to do that. I think there is a risk of that, and I would do my absolute best to mitigate that risk. I think there is some risk, sure. I mean, I think it's it's legitimate for people to be concerned about that. You know, and there is the issue that, you know. Let me back up and say, 5 or 6 years ago, maybe even longer, 10 years ago, I sponsored legislation and lobbied the state legislature to change a state law to allow our charter amendment provision to go back into effect because the state had taken it away from us. And it required 5 or 6 times the number of votes that are now required. So I'm a believer that the charter can be amended by petition, and I think it is on there because there's support for it, and I think the people ought to speak on that.
It seems to me you're on one sideline.
How's that?
Well, so are there any benefits to going to 27?
That's to be determined. Going to 3 terms, I think there might be some benefit. Going to 27, I don't think we know. I think theoretically there are. I don't think we know.
All right.
I mean, I think there is a potential for it, but I don't think we know. I don't think it's gonna. It's not like we're going to 5. It's not going to radically change the relationship between the mayor and the council. That'd be my sense.
Okay.
And with a Charter Amendment 3, do you have a position on that?
Well, you know, obviously people worked hard to get that on as well, and I think everybody would love to see more local hires on local jobs, and preferably we do it by voluntarily. But if it requires a charter amendment, then so be it.
How would you have approached the recent rejection of the 3 big projects by the mayor, the flood protection system, the police headquarters on Jefferson Street, and the jail moving to Antioch?
I think you start 4 years before you get there. You know, I think the issue, I guess the city's disappointment should be that we never really got to the substance of those issues. We really we got stuck on the process part. People felt like they hadn't been heard. People felt like they had not been included in the process up until that point, and we never really got to have a full-on debate about whether or not any of those made sense. Now, fortunately, none of those are crisis, right? I mean, none of the 3 are imminent. I mean, it's not like we had to vote on refinancing bonds, or we would go into default or something crazy like that. And all 3 of them can wait. So, and we can still do them later if we need to. So it goes back to what I talked about at the beginning. You know, day one, I'm going to go talk to the mayor about a better public engagement policy so that we can avoid those kind of problems.
What are the things that you're concerned about? We talked about Nashville and its growth and its unprecedented growth and how
Right.
that is changing. What are the things that you, as more than just a candidate, as a citizen here in Davidson County, what are the things that worry you about the next 8 years?
Well, transit, obviously, we talked a little bit about that. You know, I think we do have a regional crisis in terms of transit, and the growth in Nashville is only a part of the problem. There's growth in Rutherford and Wilson and Williamson. Every other county is growing too. So we're becoming, you know, 24 and 40 Nolensville Road. All these arteries are blocked and getting worse by the day. So that is a crisis. That's one thing. The next mayor is going to have to hit the ground running on that issue and really make a lot of progress. Everybody is concerned with affordable housing, although everybody has a different definition of what that means. So we need a good community discussion about, you know, what does it mean? What do we want? And how are we going to accomplish it?
What does it mean to you?
Well, the definition under HUD for affordable housing is 120% of area median income. So that's what it means to me. I've been on the board of the Housing Fund, which is a local community development financial institution doing affordable housing lending for 10 years. So that's what it means. No, I'm sorry, it's 80%. It's 80% of AMI.
Okay.
Workforce housing is up to 120, so 80% of AMI.
And what you mean is that your cost of housing can't exceed
80% of the area median income. I think area median income is $46,000 or something like that. So you do 80% of that. You then say, what should a person making that amount pay for their housing? And then you go out and
30%, right?
Yeah. So then you go out and look and say, well, how many housing units do we have? And we have some workforce housing in Nashville still, not necessarily exactly where people want to live, and not necessarily close to public transportation. That's a problem. The real crisis, I mean, like the immediate crisis, is that we're not building any housing for people making minimum wage. We're tearing it down. We're losing units every day, net. And so and the only way I believe to confront that is to spend more public money. I mean, that is it. And so one example I've used on affordable housing is over at 10th and Ackland. There was probably a 1940s cottage-style house that was torn down last October. It was appraised at $200,000 more or less. Its taxes had been capped at $1,500 a year because it was a senior citizen. They paid it off. Cost to live there $400 or $500 a month, maybe less.
Right.
Two $500,000 houses went up, which there's only a small segment of our community that can afford. So that's bad. But the taxes collected there went from $1,500 to almost $12,000 a year. So there are new revenues associated with this development. We have to be intentional about taking that increment, that increase, and reinvesting it in affordable housing in our community. Affordable and workforce and extremely low income housing. We've got to do it, or we're going to end up with only very, very poor people and only very, very rich people. And that's not good for our community in the long run. Additionally, it compounds the transportation problem. Because if somebody moves from 12 South, where that house was, to Antioch, their time in a car going back and forth to work adds up. So it's very complicated.
Or even more likely move out to an outer county.
Right. Yeah. So it adds to the problem when we don't have a diversity of housing stocks
Right.
in the core of the city.
So let's loop back to amendment number 3, which says we're going to fill jobs on city contracts for people that live in the county at a time when people that would be filling those jobs have a hard time living in this county.
Right.
So is there logic in that?
It'd be harder to do, wouldn't it? So it may make things more complicated to comply with that. And ideally we don't need that charter amendment. Ideally, we have enough workers in town to fill all our jobs. But I think if you talk to the Chamber of Commerce, they'll say that if you look out at the near future, we're going to have a real shortage of workers in our community. And not just construction workers, but across the board. So we have an issue to deal with there. Now, you're right. It creates everything is related
Right.
to
The
varying
intent
degrees.
behind the amendment, I think it's what
Right.
I heard you say. Really, the intent behind the amendment may be a good intent, but
Right.
perhaps the execution might be.
I think it'll pass. Because in people's guts, the people who are going to vote in the election are going to agree with it.
Interesting.
That'd be my sense, is people say, well, yeah, that's right. It's my money. We should pay people here, right? I mean, in your gut,
Right.
It seems right. There are some complicating factors to it, though.
Yeah.
What are ways that you can influence the council, for example, to influence the mayor's agenda? For example, you have obviously the tie-breaking vote, but also you can assign people to committees, and these folks will be voting on a budget for the mayor. Talk a little bit about your approach again. You spoke about the whole notion of transparency, the rewarding, and all those kind of. I'm just curious more in terms of how you really influence from your seat that agenda that you think
Right.
is so important.
Well, so I've talked to a lot of the council members about what they want to do. I've already started the process of just communicating with people, and what is your goal? What is your objective? What do you want to do? And so I believe that the vice mayor's role is to make sure that council members become experts on the topic that they are concerned about. So if there is a council member who wants to lead on affordable housing, I'm going to make sure that I do everything I can to make them the expert on it. If the expert on every issue resides in the Metro Council, then the mayor is going to have to correspond with them and work with them on those issues. It's about leadership. It's really there's not some sort of trick to making it happen.
Okay. A question, by the way, for readers, because I didn't speak loudly enough, related to leadership style and influencing the council to affect the budget and leadership things. So I will speak.
All right. Sorry.
That's my problem. I'm certainly also, if we talk about decorum, and I know there's certain limits currently on how long a council member can speak. There's the impression, it seems by some, that there's really no debate anymore on council. Do you believe it's important to bring back that debate, or do you prefer the current system as it is?
Well, I do think that there was a sense that council meetings went on way too long before the current regime, let's call it, and having sat there after midnight at council meetings myself when I was an at-large member, I can tell you that is true. They did go a long time sometimes. I think there's a balance there. The time allotted to council members is not something that the vice mayor decides. It's by council rule. So at the beginning of the term, we'll adopt a new set of council rules. My sense would be that there'll be a little bit. I would promote a little bit more latitude in terms of the time council members were given to speak. And I also, as part of the whole transparency agenda, intend to make sure that more council committee meetings, although I don't see a reason really necessarily to show them live, but to videotape them, just to make sure that they are available for people to go back and look at and see what happened in the committee meetings. I think you're likely to see a little bit more lively discussion this council than the last. Not because of anything I do, but just because of who's going to get elected.
I'm curious your distinction between broadcasting meetings live versus archiving them for distribution later.
Right.
What difference does that make to you?
Well, there's only so much bandwidth on Channel 3. So I think you want to put things up that people want to see. And not every Public Works Committee meeting is not necessarily going to be something you want to see.
Right.
But
of course, we can broadcast them on the internet too.
Right, you can do that, and maybe that's what we do. But I do think it's important, if you want to go back and look at the vote in that committee, that you can go back and link to it, and find it without because constituents don't have an obligation and shouldn't be required to go to every council meeting just to find out what's going on, especially with the technology that's available. So maybe you do stream them on the internet, but I think definitely you need to make sure that there's a video record of what transpired so that people can. So that's my sense of that.
And that would be true of, so in essence, you would like to see the current system of how we archive meetings to have an index to them. Is that what I'm hearing?
Right. I mean, there's all there.
Or like the General Assembly has.
There's a long list of things that can be done to improve transparency, and that's one of them. I mean, I think there's also the potential for, right now, if you go pull up a bill, a zoning bill in particular, which is what people are most concerned about, you see the bill, but that's all you'll see when you hit that link. There's no reason that you shouldn't immediately be able to link back to the Planning Commission staff's recommendation and analysis of it. Also link to a GIS map of the location. also link to a location where you can give comments to the council member about how you feel about it, see who the applicant is, see what, there's no reason, see the committee votes, see everything should be, and it's, you know, it's going to take some time and some money to implement that, but that's how I see the transparency project being fulfilled, by adding those layers of information to each and every instance of a vote.
I'm going to show some ignorance here. What kind of staff does the vice mayor have and the council have to be able to implement that kind of change in behavior to make government, to make council both more transparent and accountable to itself and to the voters?
Well, the council has a staff of, I think it's 5 or 6 right now. And I think we'll probably end up having to add a person or two to really fulfill both that issue, the transparency part of it, and also the inclusion part of it. If we're going to be intentional and persistent about inclusion, we're not going to be able to just sort of sit on our hands. And I mean, the idea is you don't wait. You're persistent about it. You start at the beginning, and you know, it's a relatively small staff of very good people, but we probably need to add some additional help there.
In your in your thought process, as in talking about your 3 things, how will the budgeting? Let's take the last capital improvement budget. How would it be different in the Briley era of the council than it was in this last capital improvement budget and the Neighbors era?
Well, so our system is designed to have a very powerful mayor, right? And we always have, and it's done well for our community. So I don't think there's any reason to undermine the way it works generally, where the budget and the capital improvement budget come in May, and the council has to vote on them by the end of June. I think that's fine. What I think is really about changing the ethos, the ethic. And it's about saying, okay, from day one, Mayor, we expect community engagement, we expect public engagement on everything. And I think that if the mayor works hard at that and the council demands that from day one, that we will avoid a lot of the hiccups. Not all of them. You're always going to have an issue that comes up at the end where people feel like, okay, well, we didn't do a good enough job here, or people got new information, or people get agitated over new information. It's always going to happen. But I think if the public feels confident and the council members are working hard to engage with the public as we go along, and know what the capital improvement budget is, and know where to find it online, and know what it really is, a planning document, that you will avoid a lot of those hiccups. I mean, it's not really about any sort of technical changes. It's about a change and I hate to say change, it's more about improving the ethos on that issue.
Along that line, the other candidate in this race mentioned that previously, before Bill Purcell as mayor, that department heads were required to come to the committee meetings where their bills were being considered, and if they weren't there, the bill was deferred. And Purcell changed that, and apparently that has continued to be true, that department heads do not attend council committee meetings. Is that something that should change or not change? I was sort of struck by that when we had our chat yesterday.
Right. Well, you know, I would hope that a department head would want to be there, because they would understand that the council was about to consider something important to their department. And you know, a lot of that can be communicated without changing the rules. And I intend to promote and give leadership roles to people who will understand how to communicate the consequence of not attending. I mean, I hate, you know, I'm a lawyer, right? So I should want the rules to be very specific and say everything. But I think a lot of times you're more effective if you communicate without relying on a rule. And the council can can be petty sometimes, and I think you really got to work hard to focus on the substance. So if there's a substantive bill that is before a committee or the council and the department head is not there and there's a legitimate question, it would of course make sense to defer it. So I think you focus on substance as much as you possibly can on those kind of issues.
During your time as an at-large Metro Councilman for 8 years, what would you say are 2 or 3 accomplishments, and what have you learned from that experience that would make you an effective vice mayor?
Right. So I looked back yesterday in preparation to sort of make sure I had all this right. I'll list 3 things. One, in 2004, the landfill at the corner of Ashland City Highway and Briley Parkway was expanded to add a new cell. And it made it very far down the process, and nobody in the community knew about it. And when I investigated, I found that there was a postage stamp size ad in the Tennessean, and that constituted the public notice. That was it. So I proposed legislation that was adopted by the council that created the calendar system that Metro now has. So if you want to get the agenda for the Planning Commission because of the legislation I adopted, you can give them your email address, and every time a new agenda comes up, you get it. And so I consider that, although it's very procedural and minor, I think it was a big victory for transparency and inclusion. A second thing is in 2003, I sponsored legislation to create a broadband task force. And so back then in 2003, we looked at our telecommunications infrastructure here. And despite some initial reluctance from AT&T and Comcast, we all got around a table and came up with both an assessment of what we had structurally, about inclusion in terms of poverty, were people in poverty getting access, and came up with some goals to reach within 5 and 10 years.
Have we reached them?
No, we haven't, but we're moving in that direction. The Google Fiber thing is helping. Comcast is building out a lot faster, so I wish we had made more progress on that, but it's the kind of, it goes back to where I think there are ideas that germinate in the council where we can really educate and build consensus locally. And then the third thing, and this is about how I think things should work, I sponsored legislation to rewrite the council ethics ordinance. And because I did not believe that the council should write its own rules, I had a task force that was appointed and that spent a lot of time and hard work and effort, and the public drafted our ethics ordinance. They set the standards. And it was then adopted with a few minor changes, which I opposed, but it essentially is what the public wanted as our standards for ethics. So those are 3 things that I'd say I personally was very responsible for. Above and beyond that, during my term, we increased education funding significantly in an unprecedented fashion on a per pupil basis, and built more schools than had ever been built before. So there's a lot that I'd be proud of during my term.
Excellent. And if you could basically relate that to how that would affect you as a vice mayor today, because now you're going from a voting member sponsoring legislation to one who's, as you say, on the sidelines, except for a tied vote.
Right. Well, it's about communicating my experience about both, in a couple of respects, how I accomplished what I accomplished, how it impacted the community. And there are lots of instances that are not just me, that I know, that I'm aware of other people accomplish things. And then secondly, just to have some sort of historical basis about how did we get from point A to point B. Much to my wife's chagrin, even after I was off the council, I have paid a lot of attention to what's going on in Metro and feel like I'm in a good spot to both rely on my own personal experience at the council, my understanding what's going on in our city, to help council members become experts in whatever issue that they're concerned about. It could be that a council member is concerned about, a district council member is concerned about a road in their district, and there is nothing else that they are concerned about. Well, they should be the expert on that issue. They should make progress on that issue. There may be somebody else who wants to be president of the United States of America. And I'm not sure I can help much with that, but I'm going to point him in the right direction. I'm running for vice mayor because I think that role is very important. because I do think that when we are going to have consistent turnover at the council, we do have to be very proactive in terms of getting people engaged, helping them understand how it works. I'm optimistic that our community will elect good people. We generally have. We've had we almost all have always had a council that is a good cross-section of the community in which we live. And I don't see that changing. I think that we will have that again. And I think when we have that, we get good decisions generally. I mean, we're lucky as a city, right? I mean, every problem we have really is generated by our success. Almost all of them. There are a couple of exceptions, but okay, well, I'll take that any day over problems created by our failure, right?
Right.
I mean, so let's focus on doing better on some things, and I think we do have the opportunity to be a very unique place. In the sense that we're headed to a third white, a third African American, and a third other, for a third Latino and other immigrant. And when I left to go to college in 1982, there is no way I ever could have predicted that. Nobody in town would have ever predicted that. But it is, unleashing the potential of people who have come from other cultures or who have been here for a long time and have never really had the opportunity to succeed is going to generate economic activity and success and vibrance that we've never seen before. So,
absolutely. However, they're not in the new residents, our new Nashvillians, as Francis Guest calls them, do not seem to be engaged in the political process in ways that reflect at least at the ballot box. Is that something that the council should pay more attention to?
Sure. I think if you look at it demographically, there's some relatively easy answers to that, to why it's that way. The average age of the next Nashvillians, as I call them, is low.
Right.
So they're very young. I think there are 9,000 Somalis in Nashville right now, but I bet the average age is 11. And so the percentage that actually can vote is low,
right.
And they're all English as a second language, so it is. I think that's really what it's all about. It's about reaching that group that is 0 to 15. That is where the council has to be focused for a lot of reasons. Not just the getting them to vote, which would be great, but also just making sure that they are engaged in the Nashville enterprise, and that they see that there are opportunities for them to succeed in the Nashville enterprise. That is the real risk of the changing demographics, is that 15 years from now we have a generation of kids who feel like it's not a place for them to succeed. So we've got to do some things for starting today to reach out and make sure that we find pathways to success for the next Nashvillians, so that the next, my son is 12, and when he is voting in 20 years, he is voting for people who grew up here, were the next Nashvillians, found a pathway to success, and are leading our community. We will fail miserably if we don't. We've got to find those pathways, and we've got to help those build leadership in those communities.
So lots of pride in the way that Nashville defeated the English-only amendment, yet we still really communicate to the citizenry of Davidson County in English only. As part of your transparency and accountability, would that be something that you would see the council should change?
Well, yes. And so I was at the forum, I think, that that Tennessean and Turk did. Was that last week for the mayor's office, for the mayors? And one of the questions was whether or not any of the candidates speak another language, and the answer was no. Well, I speak Spanish, and as vice mayor, I'm not going to conduct the meetings in Spanish, but I will be doing outreach in Spanish I wish I could do it in 1,000 different languages, but I can only do it in one other. And just to make sure that people understand that we are listening in as many languages as we possibly can. Beyond that, I don't know what we can do. I mean, precisely. I don't know if it's time to have a simultaneous Spanish language translation of the council meetings. But I do think as part of a systematic public engagement policy, one of the things you have to consider is, okay, we have a constituency that doesn't speak English. How are we communicating with them and making sure that there's a checkbox that says we have considered it, we have a plan, and we have implemented it. So that if you're talking about, for example, one of the crises we have, which is transportation on Nolensville Road, and where it can take you 40 minutes to go a mile right now sometimes, we can't figure that problem out and have a good solution without speaking Spanish. We can't do it because we need to add mass transit there. And we need to add mass transit for the people who live there, who will use it. And finding that out requires us to speak Spanish.
We just have a few minutes left of our interview, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about Nashville Next, that process. It's going to be one of the things that the council will be dealing with in terms of amendments. Obviously, the Whites Creek amendment was deferred to after the election. Do you have a preferred way, and I know there's a planning commission issue per se, but it's still very important in terms of the debate that the council can have about how the look of the community is. The sewer lines that are connected, the field going from rural to more urban. Right. Do you have any role whatsoever in that, or what kind of role would you like to take in that?
Well, I mean, on the Whites Creek thing, that ought to wait till the next council member is elected. I think it would be wise of the current councilman just to let the next councilman decide that. I generally feel like it is the process has been good. And I give Rick Bernhardt, who is retiring, a lot of credit for the changes in the way we plan in our community. Before he came, we never even did a community plan at all, really. I mean, he has really transformed during his tenure our planning process. And he deserves the lion's share of the credit for doing that. Having said that, and I think the Nashville Next process was great, and I think we ought to stick to it. I mean, I think that is an important thing, is for the council really to stick to it and let the core of our city become urban, which is where it's headed. We ought to let that happen. But I think we also ought to stick to it outside. I mean, we ought to say, okay, well, if it says it's going to stay T2, if it's going to stay rural, it's going to stay that way. Let's stick to it for a while. Let's let our community grow in a planned way. I will say my only concern about Nashville Next is how complicated it is, about what it leaves for neighborhoods to confront. It's complicated, a lot more complicated, probably by necessity. And I think that's going to require a lot more council members to educate to first understand it, which is going to be a big part of what each district council member is going to have to get up to speed on. You're going to have probably have 15 new district people, and they're really going to have to get up to speed on that. So I'll work with whoever the planning director is not to have an hour-long meeting, and I know they will do it already, but meet with them all and figure it out and teach them how it works, because they're going to have to be advocates for their community when it comes to understanding how it works and what it's going to do to changing the zoning process.
Anything to add before we conclude?
Well, it would be a privilege to be the next vice mayor, and I've worked hard over the last year in this election, and would continue to work hard for the people of Nashville for the next 4 to make sure that the process is inclusive and transparent, and then we demand accountability from the mayor and the administration to make sure everybody's money is spent wisely, and that we both protect what's great about Nashville and move in a positive direction going forward.
Thank you. We want to thank our guest, David Briley, editorial board member Frank Daniels, and thank you to the readers of Tennessean.com. And please make sure to register to vote. July 7th is the deadline. July 17th, early voting starts, and then August 6th is the election. Thank you very much.